Her stepmother gave her to the feared Apache as punishment, but he loved her like no other. This was not an act of mercy. This was not a mother's desperate attempt to save a wayward daughter from scandal or shame. This was calculated cruelty, dressed in the dusty veil of frontier justice, a betrayal so profound that the desert itself seemed to recoil when the deed was done. Abigail Whitaker, a woman whose smile never reached her pale gray eyes, had bartered away her stepdaughter's life as coldly as one might sell a lame horse to the glue factory, hoping the transaction would end with blood soaking into the red Arizona clay and a young woman's scream swallowed by the endless wind. Before that moment of betrayal, before the world tilted on its cruel axis, Eliana Thorne had known a different kind of suffering. The sprawling Thorne Ranch, nestled at the foot of the Chiricahua Mountains where the land cracked like old leather under the relentless sun, had once been a kingdom of childhood wonder. She remembered her father, Thomas Thorne, a man whose hands were rough as bark, but whose eyes held the softness of morning light filtering through mesquite branches. He had taught her to read the language of the desert, to see opportunity in the movement of cattle markets, to understand that survival in the territory was equal parts grit and calculation. In his final days, when the fever took him and his body shook like autumn leaves, he had pressed her small hand between his calloused palms and whispered promises that she would inherit everything he had built from dust and determination. Those promises died with him. Abigail Whitaker, a woman from St. Louis who had arrived on the afternoon stage with trunks full of silk and secrets, had married Thomas in his declining years. The marriage had been brief, transactional, devoid of the warmth that frontier families relied upon to survive the isolation. After Thomas was laid beneath a simple wooden cross in the family plot, Abigail's mask of widowed sorrow slipped away like morning frost under the harsh sun. She looked at Eliana not with a stepmother's affection, but with the cold assessment of a woman calculating the value of an obstacle. The young woman, barely past her 20th year, stood between Abigail and complete control of the vast Thorne holdings, thousands of acres of grazing land, water rights that were worth more than gold in this scorched territory, and contracts with the army that paid in reliable government silver. The house became a cage of whispers and locked doors. Eliana found herself relegated to the role of servant in her own home, her belongings slowly disappearing. Her father's personal effects burned in the courtyard fire pit as Abigail systematically erased any evidence of the previous Mrs. Thorne's existence. The ranch hands, loyal men who had worked alongside her father, were replaced one by one with Abigail's hired men, rougher types with calculating eyes and hands that lingered too long on their gun belts. Eliana felt the walls closing in, felt the trap being constructed around her with the precision of a spider spinning its web. But even in her isolation, Eliana noticed something that her stepmother had not counted on. Among her father's old papers, hidden in a leather-bound journal he kept in his study, were notes about land deeds and legal documents that did not match what Abigail now claimed. The handwriting was wrong, the dates were suspicious. Her father had always been meticulous, his record-keeping as precise as his business dealings, and these discrepancies gnawed at Eliana like a persistent ache. She said nothing, merely observed, waiting for the right moment to understand what she had discovered. That moment never came. Instead, Abigail struck first with the efficiency of a rattlesnake. On a blistering afternoon when the heat made the air shimmer like water, 3 rough men arrived at the ranch with a wagon. They spoke in hushed tones with Abigail on the wide porch, while Eliana watched from her bedroom window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. That evening, Abigail announced with theatrical sorrow that Eliana had become uncontrollable, that her grief over her father's death had twisted into dangerous rebellion, and that for her own safety and the safety of the household, she must be sent away for correction. The words were poison wrapped in concern, spoken loud enough for the few remaining loyal hands to hear. Before dawn, Eliana was bound, her wrists tied with rough hemp that bit into her skin, and placed in the back of that same wagon. The journey that followed was a descent into nightmare. The men drove her deep into the foothills to a place where the rocks rose like broken teeth against the sky, and the shadows pooled thick as oil. This place had a name that frontier folk spoke in hushed tones: the Devil's Fist, a jagged formation of red stone where the boundary between the settled world and Apache territory blurred into dangerous ambiguity. Here, deals were made that honest men would never speak of in daylight. As the wagon rattled to a stop, Eliana saw them, warriors emerging from the heat shimmer like vengeful spirits, their bodies painted with ochre and ash, their faces unreadable as carved stone. Her captors exchanged words she could not hear, passing something between them that glinted in the merciless sunlight. Then they were gone, retreating back toward civilization with a speed that spoke of guilty consciences, leaving her alone, with men whose very names were used to frighten children into obedience. The warrior who approached her moved with the fluid grace of a hunting cat. His shoulders were broad as canyon walls, his skin burnished copper by years under the desert sun, and his eyes, those eyes held depths that seemed to reflect centuries of survival, of adaptation, of watching empires rise and crumble into dust. This was Chato, a name that white settlers invoked with the same terror they reserved for drought and disease. But as he studied Eliana, bound and trembling in the wagon bed, his expression was not one of savage triumph. It was analytical, measuring, seeking something beneath the surface of her fear. He cut her bonds with a knife that caught the light like captured lightning, the blade passing so close to her skin that she felt its whisper. Yet he did not harm her. Instead, he tilted his head, observing the way she held herself despite her terror, noting the defiant set of her jaw even as tears tracked through the dust on her cheeks. In her ruined silk dress meant for parlors and afternoon tea, she looked absurdly out of place against the brutal landscape. But there was something in her eyes, a spark that refused to dim even in the shadow of certain death, that gave Chato pause. He spoke a single word in his language, its meaning lost to her, then gestured toward the eastern ridge where the rest of his band waited like patient wolves. Eliana understood without translation. She would walk, or she would be carried. She chose to walk, her legs shaking but her spine straight, following this terrifying stranger into the unknown. Behind her, the wagon tracks were already being erased by the wind, as if her previous life was being swept clean from the earth's memory. What neither Eliana nor her stepmother knew was that among the items Abigail had burned in her zealous purge of the household was an old leather journal belonging to Thomas Thorne's first wife, Eliana's mother. That woman, dead these many years, had written extensively about her friendship with a band of peaceful Apache traders who had once camped near the ranch, sharing knowledge of medicinal plants and water sources. She had even sketched their faces, capturing the dignity and honor she saw in their survival. One of those sketches bore a remarkable resemblance to the young warrior who now was an older man leading Eliana into the mountains, a connection buried in ashes that neither party yet understood. The rancheria appeared like a mirage carved into the mountainside, a collection of wickiups woven from willow branches and desert grass that seemed to grow organically from the red earth itself. Smoke from cooking fires rose in lazy spirals, carrying the scent of roasting meat and something sharp and herbal that made Eliana's empty stomach clench with hunger. As Chato led her through the entrance, a profound silence fell over the gathered people. Women paused in their weaving, children stopped their play, and warriors turned from sharpening their weapons to study this pale ghost who had been brought into their midst. Eliana felt the weight of their gazes like physical touch, assessing and measuring every trembling breath she took. She saw curiosity in some faces, suspicion in others, and in a few, something that looked disturbingly like pity. They knew what she did not yet understand, that she had been discarded, thrown away like refuse by her own people, and that her survival now depended on proving she possessed value beyond the color of her skin or the language on her tongue. An elderly woman emerged from the largest wickiup, her face a roadmap of wrinkles earned through decades of desert survival, her eyes sharp as obsidian blades. This was Enju, a name that would later translate in Eliana's mind as something between teacher and tormentor. The old woman circled the young white woman slowly, reaching out to pinch the soft flesh of her arms, to examine her hands that had known only the gentle resistance of embroidery needles and piano keys. When Enju spoke, Her words were clipped and harsh in the Apache tongue, but her meaning was crystal clear in the dismissive wave of her hand. This soft creature would be useless, would likely die before the next full moon. Chato responded with words that held the weight of command, gesturing toward Eliana, with a firmness that suggested the matter was not open for debate. The old woman's eyes narrowed, studying the warrior with an expression that seemed to see through flesh to the motivations beneath. Finally, with a grunt that could have meant anything from acceptance to resignation, Enju grabbed Eliana's wrist and dragged her toward the women's area of the camp, where clay vessels and stretched hides waited for processing. The first task assigned to her was hauling water from a spring half a mile down the mountainside. Eliana was given a large olla, a clay vessel that seemed impossibly heavy even when empty, and was pointed toward a narrow trail that disappeared into the scrub brush. She lifted the vessel, feeling its rough texture against her soft palms, and began the descent. The weight grew unbearable within minutes, her muscles screaming in protest, sweat soaking through her already ruined dress. She stumbled, nearly dropping the precious container, and heard the barely concealed laughter of watching children who had made this journey countless times without complaint. But something her father had once told her surfaced through the fog of exhaustion. He had spoken of Mexican workers on the ranch who carried heavy loads by finding a rhythm, by making the weight part of their movement rather than fighting against it. Eliana adjusted her grip, finding the vessel's balance point, and began to walk with shorter, more deliberate steps. The laughter faded. By the time she reached the spring, her hands were raw and her back felt like fire, but she had not dropped the olla. The spring itself was a miracle of the desert, clear water bubbling from between ancient rocks, surrounded by ferns that seemed impossibly green against the dusty landscape. As Eliana knelt to fill the vessel, she noticed something odd, scratches in the smooth stone beside the water, marks that were too regular to be natural. They looked almost like the tally marks her father had used in his ledgers, a counting system. She filed this observation away, sensing without understanding that knowledge of this place held significance beyond simple water collection. The journey back up the slope was agony. The filled olla weighed more than she would have thought possible, and her legs trembled with each step, yet she forced herself to continue, remembering her father's voice speaking of frontier survival, of how weakness was the one luxury no one in the territory could afford. When she finally reached the camp, her dress soaked with sweat and spring water from the inevitable sloshes, Enju took the vessel and examined it critically. The old woman's expression revealed nothing, but she did not send Eliana back for more, which in itself felt like a small victory. The following days blurred into a relentless cycle of labor that seemed designed to break her spirit. She scraped hides until her fingers bled, the smell of tanning chemicals and dried meat becoming as familiar as her own breath. She ground corn into meal using stones that seemed determined to crush her hands along with the grain. She learned to bank fires so they would burn through the night without consuming too much precious wood, to identify which plants held water in their roots, to move through the camp without disturbing the intricate social hierarchies she was only beginning to understand. Through it all, Chato watched from a distance, never interfering but always present like a shadow at the edge of her vision. She felt his gaze during the moments when she wanted to collapse, when the work seemed impossible, and the urge to simply give up whispered seductively in her mind. Something about his silent observation, not judgment, but something closer to patient assessment, kept her moving when her body screamed for rest. A week into her captivity, a group of mountain traders arrived at the rancheria. Rough white men with pack mules laden with goods to exchange for the Apache's tanned hides and basket work. Eliana watched from the women's area as the negotiation began, conducted in a mixture of broken Spanish and hand gestures. The lead trader, a man with tobacco-stained teeth and calculating eyes, was showing Enju a bolt of blue cloth, praising its quality while simultaneously arguing for a lower price on the hides she offered in exchange. But Eliana's father had taught her to spot fraud in textile trades. She had spent countless afternoons in his study as he examined fabric samples sent from Eastern suppliers, learning to recognize the difference between quality wool and cotton mixed with cheaper fibers. This blue cloth the trader was passing off as pure wool was clearly blended, evident in the way it caught the light and the slightly stiff drape of the material. The trader was cheating Enju, expecting the Apache woman's ignorance of white manufacturing techniques to work in his favor. Before she could think about the wisdom of her actions, Eliana rose and walked toward the trading circle. The conversation stopped abruptly, all eyes turning to her with expressions ranging from surprise to anger at the interruption. She pointed at the cloth, then at the pile of perfectly tanned hides, and shook her head firmly. Using the few Spanish words she had picked up from ranch workers, combined with gestures, she indicated that the cloth was false, mixed, worth far less than the trader claimed. The trader's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment at being exposed, but Enju's sharp eyes had immediately gone to the fabric, her weathered fingers testing it with a knowledge born of years evaluating materials. The old woman's expression darkened as she confirmed what Eliana had indicated. She thrust the cloth back at the trader and demanded double the amount of hides she had originally offered, or no deal at all. The trader, knowing he had been caught and that word of his dishonesty would spread quickly among the Apache bands, had no choice but to accept the revised terms or leave empty-handed. After the traders departed, moving down the mountain trail with considerably lighter packs, Enju turned to Eliana, with an expression that was still severe, but held a flicker of something new. Grudging respect. The old woman gestured for Eliana to follow her back to the wickiup, where she offered a bowl of stew without the usual air of resentment. It was a small gesture, but in the economy of this harsh world, it spoke volumes about shifting status. That night, as Eliana lay on her sleeping mat woven from yucca fibers, she overheard fragments of conversation from the central fire. She did not yet understand the Apache language, but she recognized the rhythmic pattern of storytelling, and she heard her own name spoken in their tongue, whatever Chato had named her, something that sounded like wind through canyon stones. The tone was not hostile. It was curious, questioning, as if the band was trying to understand what exactly had been deposited in their midst. What Eliana could not know was that Enju, in her youth, had traveled with a small band that had once camped near the Thorne Ranch, when Thomas Thorne's first wife still lived. The old woman had vague memories of a kind white woman who had shared food and medicine, who had treated the Apache with dignity rather than fear. The resemblance between that long-dead woman and this young one was subtle but persistent, visible in the shape of the eyes, the set of the jaw. Enju did not speak of this memory. Not yet, but it lingered in her mind like smoke from a distant fire, connecting past to present in ways that the spirits alone understood. The crisis came with the brutal suddenness of a summer storm breaking over the mountains. A child, a boy barely 6 years old named Little Hawk, had been playing near the canyon edge when the earth beneath his feet gave way, ancient sandstone crumbling like broken promises. His fall was not far, perhaps 15 feet, but the angle was wrong and he struck an outcropping with sickening force. His screams brought the entire rancheria running, but when they reached him, those screams had faded to whimpers that were somehow more terrifying than the initial cries. The boy's leg was bent at an angle that made even the hardened warriors look away, bone pressing against skin from within like something trying to escape. His mother, a young woman named Singing Bird, was hysterical with grief and terror, clutching at her son while others tried to assess the damage. The band's healer, an ancient man whose hands shook with palsy, examined Little Hawk with a grave expression. He prepared his medicines, burning sage and mixing poultices, but even Eliana, with her limited understanding, could see the doubt in his eyes. The old man had treated wounds and fevers, snake bites and infections, but this kind of injury, a compound break that threatened to pierce the skin, was beyond the remedies he knew. Time became elastic, stretching into an agony of waiting as the healer worked. But as the hours passed, the boy's whimpers grew fainter, and his skin took on a grayish pallor that spoke of shock settling into his small body. His leg was swelling grotesquely, the flesh turning dark as storm clouds, and Eliana knew with horrible certainty that infection would soon follow. In the civilized settlements, a doctor might set such a break with metal pins and proper splints, but here in the mountains. The child's chances of survival were growing thinner with each passing moment. A memory surfaced from Eliana's childhood with the clarity of spring water. Her father, in one of his rare moments of vulnerability, had told her about his own father, a man who had served as a battlefield surgeon during the Mexican War. Thomas Thorne had inherited not just his father's business acumen, but also his medical journals, leather-bound books filled with detailed sketches and instructions for treating field injuries when proper doctors were unavailable. Eliana had read those journals during long winter evenings, fascinated by the anatomical drawings and the practical wisdom they contained. One section had dealt specifically with compound fractures, with step-by-step instructions for realignment and immobilization. She had never performed such a procedure, had never even witnessed one. But the child was dying before her eyes, and the alternative to acting was watching little Hawk slip away while his mother's wails tore through the mountain air. Eliana pushed through the gathered crowd, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, and knelt beside the injured boy. She looked up at Enju, at Chato who had appeared at the commotion, at Singing Bird whose face was a mask of desperate hope, and made a series of gestures that communicated both confidence and need. She could help, but she required specific items. The skepticism was immediate and palpable. The old healer bristled at the implied insult to his abilities, but Enju, remembering the incident with the traders, silenced him with a sharp word. Chato's dark eyes fixed on Eliana with an intensity that felt like sunlight through a magnifying glass, burning away pretense to see what lay beneath. Then he nodded once, a gesture that held the weight of granted authority, and gestured for others to bring what she requested. Eliana demanded clean water boiled until it steamed, strips of leather that could be softened and shaped, straight branches from the willow thicket, and the strongest whiskey from the trader goods. As these items were gathered, she forced herself to recall every detail from her grandfather's journal, visualizing the diagrams of proper bone alignment, the descriptions of how to feel for the correct placement despite the swelling and pain. Her hands were shaking, but she could not afford to let fear control them now. The procedure that followed would haunt her dreams for years. She cleaned her hands in the boiling water, ignoring the way her skin turned red from the heat, then poured whiskey over the boy's leg while others held him still. His screams resumed with renewed vigor, but infection was the greater danger now. With fingers that felt clumsy and inadequate, she probed the swollen tissue, feeling for the displaced bone beneath. The sensation made her stomach heave, but she swallowed the bile and continued, whispering prayers she had learned in childhood and apologies she hoped the child's spirit could understand. The moment of realignment required more strength than she knew she possessed. She had to pull against contracted muscles and shift the bone back into its proper place, while Little Hawk's screams reached a pitch that seemed to crack the sky itself. But then she felt it, the subtle shift of bone sliding back into alignment, the way the unnatural angle straightened into something closer to normal. She splinted the leg with the willow branches, binding them tightly with softened leather strips, creating an immobilization that would allow the bone to knit back together, if infection could be prevented. When it was finished, Eliana sat back on her heels, her entire body shaking with released tension, her hands covered in blood and sweat. Little Hawk had mercifully passed into unconsciousness, his breathing shallow but steady. Singing Bird was sobbing, but these were different tears, tears that held a thread of hope rather than pure despair. The gathered crowd was silent, processing what they had just witnessed. This white woman, this discarded thing that had been brought to them in shame, had just saved a child's life using knowledge that none of them possessed. But in the chaos of the moment, as Eliana had worked on the boy's leg, she had noticed something that her conscious mind had registered without fully processing. Little Hawk's mother, Singing Bird, wore around her neck a small leather pouch on a worn cord. The pouch had fallen open during her frantic movements, and inside, visible for just a moment, was a small silver locket. The craftsmanship was distinctive, Mexican in style, with a delicate engraving of a flowering cactus. Eliana had seen that exact locket before, in a portrait of her mother that her father had kept in his study. It was a unique piece, commissioned by her maternal grandfather and said to be one of only 3 ever made. The implications of this discovery washed over Eliana like cold water. Her mother had known these people, had been close enough to them to gift such a personal item. The stories her father had told of her mother's independent spirit, her unexplained absences from the ranch, her fascination with the Apache culture, these fragments suddenly coalesced into a fuller picture. Her mother had not just observed these people from a distance. She had been part of their lives in some meaningful way. And now, decades later, her daughter had been delivered back to them through the cruelest of coincidences, a circle closing that neither party had intended. As Eliana rose on unsteady legs, she felt Chato's presence beside her. He did not speak, but his hand briefly touched her shoulder, a gesture so subtle that others might have missed it. But to her it felt like a benediction. In his eyes, she saw something that had not been there before. Recognition of equals. The look one survivor gives another when they witness true courage. He had been testing her, she realized, not with violence but with observation, waiting to see if the spark he had sensed at the devil's fist was real, or merely a desperate defiance that would crumble under hardship. That night, after Little Hawk's fever broke, and he took sips of broth from his mother's trembling hands, the rancheria gathered around the central fire for a ceremony that Eliana did not fully understand. Chato spoke at length, his voice carrying the cadence of formal pronouncement, and though she could not follow the words, she recognized her presence at the center of his speech. When he finished, Enju approached Eliana and placed around her neck a simple cord with a single turquoise stone, not the elaborate jewelry of high status, but the mark of someone who had earned basic acceptance within the community. Yet even as Eliana felt the stone settle against her chest, warm from Enju's hands, she carried the weight of her discovery about the locket. She looked across the fire at Singing Bird, who was rocking her sleeping son, and wondered what stories that silver pendant could tell. The connection between her mother and these people was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a truth to be understood, and that understanding would require time, trust, and the courage to ask questions whose answers might fundamentally change everything she thought she knew about her own history. The weeks that followed Little Hawk's healing marked a subtle but profound shift in the rhythm of Eliana's existence. The child's leg mended with the stubborn resilience of youth, the bone knitting straight beneath the splint she had fashioned. Each morning, she checked his progress under Singing Bird's watchful eye, and each morning, she felt the weight of the locket question pressing against her thoughts like a stone in her shoe. But she did not ask. Not yet. There was an art to survival in this world, and she was learning that timing was everything, that rushing toward truth could be as dangerous as avoiding it entirely. Her role within the rancheria evolved without formal announcement, the change occurring through the accumulation of small actions and earned trust. The women no longer watched her with open suspicion when she approached the water spring or the tanning racks. Children who had once scattered at her presence now trailed after her with curious eyes, occasionally offering her bits of roasted grasshopper or mesquite beans as tentative gifts. She was not yet one of them, but she was no longer entirely other, existing in that liminal space where transformation begins, without anyone quite noticing the moment it started. Chato remained a constant but enigmatic presence. He did not seek her out directly, but their paths crossed with a frequency that suggested intention rather than chance. She would be gathering firewood on the eastern slope and find him there, ostensibly checking snares, but always positioning himself between her and the more dangerous approaches to the camp. During the communal meals, she would feel his gaze from across the fire, not intrusive but present. A steady weight that she found herself leaning into like a tree grows toward consistent sunlight. One evening, as the sun painted the canyon walls in shades of blood and honey, Eliana found herself working beside the creek that fed the camp's water supply. She was washing clay from a batch of newly dug pottery vessels, the cold water numbing her fingers, when Chato appeared upstream. He carried a brace of rabbits, fresh kills that would feed several families, and knelt at the water's edge to clean them. For long minutes, they worked in parallel silence, the only sounds the rush of water over stone and the distant call of a hawk riding thermal currents. Then, without looking at her directly, Chato began to speak. His words were in Spanish, slow and careful, a language he clearly knew but used sparingly. He told her of his own arrival at this rancheria, years ago, when he had been little more than a boy running from a massacre at his birth village. He spoke of Enju, who had been younger then but no less formidable, and how she had tested him with the same relentless labor she now imposed on Eliana. He described the pain of losing his original family, the guilt of surviving when others had not, and the slow process of building new connections that could never replace what was lost, but could honor it through the act of continuing to live with purpose. Eliana listened, her hands stilling in the cold water, understanding that this was not casual conversation, but something more significant, a sharing of story as foundation for deeper trust. When he finished, she found herself reciprocating without conscious decision, telling him about her father's death, about the suffocating cage her stepmother had constructed, about the moment in the wagon when she had understood that her own people had discarded her as thoroughly as one might abandon a broken tool. She spoke of her mother, the woman she barely remembered, and the persistent sense that there were truths about her family's past that had been deliberately obscured. As she spoke, Chato's hands never stopped their efficient work cleaning the rabbits, but she could feel the quality of his attention, the way he absorbed not just her words but the emotions beneath them. When she mentioned her mother's connection to the Apache, he paused for just a heartbeat, his knife glinting in the fading light before resuming his task. The pause was brief enough to be coincidental, but Eliana had learned to read the small signals of this world, and she knew she had touched on something significant. The ritual of shared labor became their unspoken language. He taught her to identify the plants that held medicinal properties, crushing leaves between his fingers to release scents that would have made her grandmother's garden seem tame, sharp, mineral, ancient. She showed him the tallying system she had begun implementing for the trading goods, using marks similar to those she had seen by the spring to track what was owed and what was owned. He studied her marks with the careful attention of someone who recognized the value of any system that brought order to chaos, eventually incorporating her method into the band's broader resource management. During one particular evening, as they worked together to repair a section of the camp's windbreak fence that had been damaged in a storm, Eliana felt the barrier of isolation that had surrounded her since her father's death begin to crack like river ice in spring. Chato was showing her how to weave willow branches in a pattern that would flex with wind rather than break against it, his hands guiding hers through the motion. The physical proximity, innocent in purpose but intimate in execution, made her acutely aware of the warmth radiating from his skin, despite the desert's evening chill, the scent of sage smoke and desert air that clung to his clothing. In that moment, she realized with a clarity that was both frightening and exhilarating that she felt safer in this harsh mountain camp, working beside a man whose language she barely spoke, than she ever had in her father's ranch house with all its civilized comforts. The realization was not a simple happiness, but something more complex, an acknowledgement that belonging was not about walls and inheritance, but about the quality of attention others paid to your existence, about being seen as valuable beyond what you could provide or produce. Enju, observing this growing connection with the shrewd eye of someone who had navigated tribal politics for decades, finally approached Eliana one morning with the silver locket in her weathered palm. The old woman had taken it from Singing Bird's belongings, not theft but examination, and now held it out between them like a bridge across decades of silence. She spoke in a mixture of Apache and Spanish, her words coming slowly as she dredged up memories from long ago. The locket had been a gift from Eliana's mother to Singing Bird's grandmother, a woman who had served as midwife and healer to the band in those days. The two women had formed an unlikely friendship during a period when the ranch and the rancheria had existed in careful peace, trading goods and knowledge across the cultural divide. When Eliana's mother had died in childbirth, the loss had been mourned by both communities, and the locket had been kept as a sacred object, passed down through generations as a reminder that understanding between their worlds was possible, though rare and precious as spring water in drought. The revelation struck Eliana with the force of a physical blow. Her mother had not just known these people. She had been woven into their history, had left a legacy of compassion that had rippled forward through time. The connection between Eliana and this place was not the random cruelty of her stepmother's betrayal, but something deeper, a calling home to a people her mother had loved. The universe, in its mysterious and often brutal way, had returned her to the exact place her mother's spirit had found kinship, closing a circle that began before Eliana was even born. That night, as stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Eliana sat with Chato on a flat rock overlooking the valley below. They did not speak much, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with the ambient music of crickets and distant coyotes. She understood now why he had looked at her with such immediate recognition at the devil's fist. Not because he knew her personally, but because he saw in her the echo of a woman who had once shown his people dignity and respect. In saving her, he was honoring a debt that his band owed to her mother's memory, but what had begun as obligation had transformed into something else entirely. The desert wind carried the scent of creosote and dust, and somewhere in the darkness below, a night bird called its lonely song. Eliana felt Chato's hand cover hers briefly, a gesture that spoke of protection and promise, of two people who had found in each other an unexpected answer to questions they had not known how to ask. The touch lasted only a moment before he withdrew, mindful of propriety and the watching eyes of the camp, but the warmth of it lingered on her skin like a blessing. The peace of the high mountains, fragile as spider silk, began to show its first tears on an afternoon when the wind blew wrong. It came from the southwest instead of its usual eastern flow, carrying with it scents that made the camp's dogs restless and sent the warriors reaching for their weapons, with the unconscious reflex of men who had survived too many attacks. Chato stood at the eastern outlook, his body a statue of focused attention, reading signals in the landscape that Eliana was only beginning to understand. The absence of bird calls, the way dust rose in unnatural patterns along the distant trail, the quality of silence that preceded violence. He spoke quickly to the gathered warriors, his words clipped and urgent in Apache, then dispatched scouts in 3 directions like spokes from a wheel's hub. Eliana watched from the women's area, her hands stilling over the basket she had been weaving, as the entire rancheria shifted into a state of alert preparation that was both terrifying and grimly efficient. This was not the first time they had faced danger, and the practiced ease with which even the children moved to their assigned safe positions spoke of a people who lived always one step ahead of annihilation. Enju appeared at Eliana's side, pressing a small knife into her hand, not a warrior's blade but the kind used for cutting leather, its edge worn but still serviceable. The old woman's eyes held no room for argument as she pointed to the shallow cave system at the mountain's base where the most vulnerable members of the community would shelter. Eliana understood the implication. If whatever approached breached the camp's defenses, that knife was not for fighting, but for preventing capture. The Apache knew too well what happened to their people, especially their women, when they fell into the hands of certain men. The scouts returned before sunset with news that drained the color from even the most battle-hardened faces. A group of men, perhaps a dozen strong, was ascending the mountain trails with purpose that suggested specific knowledge rather than random exploration. These were not regular army patrols, whose movements were predictable and whose primary concern was typically avoiding engagement. These men moved like bounty hunters, like trackers paid to find specific quarry, and they were following a path that should have been known only to those who had traveled these heights for years. Chato gathered his senior warriors in urgent council, their voices low and intense as they debated responses. Eliana could not follow the rapid Apache discourse, but she caught fragments of Spanish mixed in, and she heard her own name, or rather, the name they had given her, repeated several times. The realization crept over her like cold shadow. This threat was not random. These men were here for a reason that connected directly to her presence in the camp. As darkness fell, Singing Bird approached Eliana in the shelter cave, Little Hawk sleeping peacefully against her shoulder despite the tension crackling through the air. The young mother spoke in halting Spanish, her words coming with difficulty, as she explained what the scouts had learned. The men ascending the mountain were led by one of Abigail's hired hands, a man named Dalton, who had a reputation for finding things that others wanted to stay lost. He had been asking questions in Silver Creek, spreading silver among the town's more flexible citizens, inquiring about Apache bands and specifically about any white women who might have been taken by them. The betrayal cut deeper than Eliana would have expected. Some part of her, despite everything, had hoped that her stepmother might have experienced even a flicker of regret, might have wondered if the young woman she had sent to her presumed death had somehow survived. Instead, Abigail was spending money to ensure the job was finished, to close the loose end that Eliana's continued existence represented. The ranch, the inheritance, the life her father had built. Abigail would not rest secure in her theft until Eliana was confirmed dead and buried. But the complexity of the situation revealed itself in fragments overheard and carefully translated. Dalton had brought with him a man who claimed to be a territorial marshal, though the legitimacy of his badge was questionable, given how far he was operating beyond any reasonable jurisdiction. This marshal carried papers, writs that authorized the recovery of a stolen white woman being held against her will by hostile Indians. The legal fiction was perfect in its cynicism. If Abigail could not simply murder her stepdaughter outright, she would use the law's veneer to achieve the same end, framing Eliana's rescue as a civic duty, while ensuring that any attempt by the young woman to speak truth about her situation would be dismissed as the traumatized ravings of a captive whose mind had been broken by her ordeal. The night was long and tense, marked by the sounds of preparations for defense and the awful waiting that preceded violence. Warriors checked their weapons, women gathered emergency supplies in case rapid evacuation became necessary, and children were instructed in whispered tones about which direction to run if the camp was overrun. Eliana found herself seated near Chato as he methodically prepared his rifle, an old Springfield that had likely been taken from a cavalry ambush years before. His movements were unhurried, each action performed with the careful attention of ritual, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his dark eyes kept returning to the trail where enemies would appear. She touched his arm, drawing his attention, and in her inadequate Spanish mixed with gestures, she tried to convey what she had only just fully understood herself. She was not worth this. Not worth the risk to the children sleeping in the cave. Not worth the blood that would certainly be spilled if this confrontation escalated. She could walk down the mountain, could surrender herself to Dalton and his false marshal, could face whatever fate Abigail had planned for her. It would be a defeat, yes, and likely a fatal one, but it would spare these people who had shown her more genuine kindness than her own blood relatives. Chato's response was immediate and fierce. He spoke rapidly in Apache, then switched to Spanish when he saw her struggling to follow, his words coming in short, intense bursts. She was not a prisoner to be traded. She was not merchandise to be returned for profit. She was a person who had saved a child's life, who had worked until her hands bled to earn her place, who carried in her blood a connection to a woman this band had respected and mourned. The debt they owed her mother was real, yes, but what kept her here now was not obligation but choice, both hers and theirs. They did not abandon their own to wolves, whether those wolves walked on 4 legs or 2. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that the desert produces after a cold night, the air so clean it felt like breathing light. The men appeared on the lower trail just after dawn, visible as small figures against the red rock, moving with the confidence of those who believed numbers and law were on their side. Dalton rode at their head, his form recognizable even at distance by the distinctive tilt of his hat and the cruel economy of his movements. Chato positioned his warriors at strategic points along the approach, places where the trail narrowed and where any aggressive advance would become a shooting gallery. But he also sent Enju forward with a white cloth tied to his staff, the universal signal for parley, because he understood that what was about to unfold was not simply a military engagement, but a negotiation whose outcome would be determined as much by words as by weapons. The parley took place on a flat area of ground between the camp and the approaching men, a space neutral enough that neither side would feel they had conceded ground by meeting there. Chato stood at the center of his warriors, Eliana at his side in a placement that was both strategic and symbolic. She was not being hidden like stolen goods, but presented as a person with agency in her own fate. Dalton dismounted, his false marshal beside him, and approached with the swagger of men who believed the law, however corrupted, gave them unassailable authority. The marshal spoke first, his voice carrying the nasal inflection of someone from the Eastern Territories who had come west seeking easier prey than could be found in more established jurisdictions. He announced his authority, brandished his papers, and demanded the immediate surrender of Miss Eliana Thorne, who was being unlawfully detained by hostile forces. His words were clipped and official, designed to intimidate through legal language and the implied violence of institutional power. But then something happened that neither Dalton nor his corrupt marshal had anticipated. Eliana stepped forward, her movements deliberate and calm, and spoke not in the broken Spanish of someone traumatized and desperate, but in clear, measured English that carried across the space between them with perfect clarity. She identified herself by her full legal name, confirmed her identity for the record, and then stated in words that could not be misunderstood. She was not a captive. She had not been kidnapped. She had been sold by her stepmother to men who intended her death, and she had been saved by the Apache band, who now gave her shelter of her own free will. The words hung in the desert air like smoke from a gunshot, and Eliana saw the flicker of panic cross Dalton's face before he could mask it. The marshal's confident posture shifted slightly, his hand moving unconsciously toward his sidearm as he processed this unexpected complication. They had come expecting to find a traumatized victim grateful for rescue, a woman whose word could be easily dismissed. Instead, they faced a composed witness whose testimony, if allowed to reach proper authorities, could unravel the entire fiction of Abigail's respectable widowhood. Dalton recovered quickly, his voice taking on a tone of patronizing concern, as he insisted that Miss Thorne was clearly not in her right mind, that her time in captivity had disordered her thoughts, that of course her stepmother was frantic with worry and eager to welcome her home. But even as he spoke, Eliana saw calculation in his eyes, the wheels turning as he considered whether it might be simpler to simply kill everyone present and claim the Apache had murdered the hostage rather than surrender her. Chato, reading the same dangerous shift in the air, made a subtle gesture that brought 3 additional warriors into view on the rocks above, their rifles clearly visible, and aimed at the parley ground. The message was unmistakable. Any violence would be mutual, and while Dalton's party might ultimately prevail through numbers, enough of them would die in the process to make the profit margin of this venture deeply unappealing. The standoff stretched into minutes that felt like hours, each side assessing angles and outcomes, weighing the cost of action against the uncertainty of retreat. Finally, it was the false marshal who blinked first, his bureaucrat's instinct for self-preservation, overriding whatever pay he had been promised. He announced that the situation was more complex than initially presented, that further investigation would be required, and that for now his authority did not extend to forcibly removing someone who claimed to be staying of their own will. The legal cowardice was transparent, but it provided face-saving cover for withdrawal. Dalton's rage was barely contained as he remounted his horse, his eyes promising future violence even as he turned back down the trail. But he had been thwarted, at least temporarily, by the one thing he and Abigail had not anticipated, that Eliana Thorne, the meek girl who had been so easily controlled and discarded, had found in the mountains not just refuge, but the steel-hard core of someone who had discovered what she was truly worth. The men retreated in bitter silence, their footprints in the dust already being erased by the wind that knew these heights better than any interloper. As the danger receded, Eliana felt her legs begin to shake with released tension, the aftermath of adrenaline leaving her hollow and trembling. Chato's hand found hers, his grip solid and grounding, and she understood with perfect clarity that this was only a reprieve, not a victory. Abigail would not stop, could not stop, because Eliana's continued existence was a threat to everything the older woman had stolen. The mountains had given her time and allies, But the war for her life and her inheritance was far from over. The attack, when Dalton finally made it, came not with the honorable clarity of open combat, but with the coward's preferred weapon: fire. He waited 3 days, long enough for the Apache to believe he had truly retreated, long enough for the hypervigilance of defense to soften into the routine of daily survival. Then, in the hours before dawn, when sleep is deepest and the watch most likely to nod off, he sent his men up the mountain carrying torches and kerosene-soaked rags, intending to burn the camp like one might smoke out a den of troublesome animals. The first wickiup to catch was on the eastern edge, closest to the approach trail. The flames spread with horrifying speed, the dry grass and willow branches becoming a roaring inferno that sent sparks spiraling into the pre-dawn darkness like malevolent stars. The screams came immediately, not just of fear but of rage, of people who had survived too much to be exterminated in their sleep by men too craven to face them in daylight. Warriors emerged from shelters with weapons already in hand, responding with the muscle memory of those who had drilled for exactly this nightmare, while women grabbed children and emergency supplies with the same practiced efficiency. Eliana found herself moving through chaos with a strange clarity, her body operating on instinct while her mind cataloged threats and resources with the cold precision her father had taught her. She saw Little Hawk being carried by his mother toward the cave system, saw Enju directing younger women to form a water brigade from the creek despite the obvious futility of stopping a blaze this advanced. The old woman's eyes met hers across the burning camp, and in that glance was a transmission of knowledge. This was not about saving structures, but about buying time for evacuation while appearing to fight, about maintaining courage in the face of catastrophe. But Chato was not retreating. He stood at the camp's center, his rifle already speaking in sharp, measured reports that echoed off the canyon walls, targeting the shadows where Dalton's men tried to move under cover of smoke and darkness. His warriors had taken defensive positions at the natural choke points, turning the terrain advantage that protected them in peace into deadly ground for anyone trying to press an attack uphill. The initial assault, meant to catch them helpless and panicked, instead ran headlong into a disciplined response that left 2 of Dalton's hired guns bleeding into the dirt before they even realized their advantage had evaporated. Through the smoke and chaos, Eliana saw Dalton himself, recognizable by his distinctive silhouette, directing his remaining men from a position of relative safety. He was screaming orders, his voice carrying notes of desperation as he realized his surprise attack had failed to produce the quick massacre he had promised his employers. She saw him pull one of his men aside, saw something passed between them. A smaller container, not kerosene but something else, something that glinted metallic in the firelight. Dynamite. They had brought mining explosives, intending to collapse the cave system if the fire did not force everyone into the open for slaughter. The realization struck her with the force of physical impact. The cave where the children sheltered, where Singing Bird was even now huddled with Little Hawk and a dozen other vulnerable souls, would become a tomb, if that charge was properly placed. The entrance was narrow, the walls ancient sandstone that would collapse like crumbling bread if the explosive hit the right structural point. She moved without conscious thought, abandoning her position at the waterline and sprinting toward the cave entrance despite the shouts of alarm from those who saw her break from cover. The man carrying the dynamite was young, barely 20, with the nervous energy of someone who had signed on for easy money and was now deep in waters too dangerous to navigate. He approached the cave entrance from above, using the rocks as cover, clearly intending to simply drop the charge down and retreat before detonation. But Eliana had spent weeks learning these trails, and she knew a shortcut through the boulders that the stranger did not. She emerged ahead of him, placing herself between him and his target, her inadequate leather-cutting knife in one hand, while her other hand gripped a stone the size of a child's head. They faced each other in a frozen moment of mutual recognition. He saw a white woman, her face streaked with soot and sweat, standing in defense of Apache children. She saw a boy who had made terrible choices and was now confronting the moment when those choices would define who he truly was. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw regret flicker across his features, a calculation of whether whatever pay he had been promised was worth killing someone who looked enough like his own sister. The decision was taken from both of them by a rifle shot that came from an unexpected direction, not from the camp defenders, but from further up the mountain, from a position that should have been empty. The young man dropped, the dynamite bundle falling from his nerveless fingers, and Eliana barely had time to dive forward and catch it before it struck stone. Her hands closed around the wrapped cylinders, their weight solid and terrifying, the fuse already lit and sparking its inexorable countdown. She ran, not toward the camp where the fire still raged, not toward the cave where precious lives sheltered, but perpendicular to both, sprinting along the narrow trail that led to the sheer drop overlooking the valley below. Her lungs burned with smoke and exertion, her vision narrowing to tunnel focus as she counted heartbeats against the shortening fuse. At the canyon's edge, she released the bundle with a prayer to any god who might be listening, watching it arc out into empty space and disappear into darkness. The explosion came before she hit the ground, the concussion wave slamming into her back and driving her forward, her hands and knees scraping against stone as she skidded to a halt just short of following the dynamite into the abyss. For several seconds, she could hear nothing but ringing silence, her ears shocked into temporary deafness by the blast. But gradually sound returned, the crackle of flames, the shouts of warriors, and somewhere close, the sound of someone approaching with careful steps. Chato appeared above her, his face a mask of soot and blood from a gash across his cheek, but his eyes were fierce with an emotion she could not quite name. He pulled her to her feet, his hands running over her arms and shoulders with rapid efficiency, checking for injuries even as his gaze kept returning to her face with an intensity that made her heart hammer, for reasons that had nothing to do with the recent danger. He spoke rapidly in Apache, words she could not follow, then switched to Spanish with clear effort at control. She had saved them, not just the children in the cave, but the entire defensive position, because Dalton's plan had relied on the dynamite forcing a retreat that would break their organized resistance. Without that card to play, his men were now pinned down in increasingly untenable positions, taking casualties from warriors who knew every stone and shadow of this terrain. The battle was not won, but the tide had turned in a way that made victory possible rather than simply dying well. But there was more that Chato needed her to understand. Information he had received from the scout, who had fired the shot that saved her life. That scout had been tracking Dalton's movements and had overheard conversations that revealed the full scope of Abigail's plan. It was not just about eliminating Eliana. It was about using her death to legitimize a land claim that Abigail had been constructing through forged documents and corrupted officials. If Eliana died in an Apache attack, the territorial government would grant Abigail emergency powers to annex additional lands bordering the ranch, lands that held newly discovered copper deposits worth more than a decade of cattle sales. Her stepdaughter's murder was just business, calculated with the cold efficiency of a banker foreclosing on a failing loan. The knowledge settled into Eliana's bones with the weight of absolute certainty. There would be no peace, no compromise, no chance of simply hiding in the mountains and hoping Abigail would eventually give up. Her stepmother had invested too much money and effort into this venture, had exposed herself to too much potential legal liability if the truth emerged. Eliana's continued existence was not just an obstacle, but a mortal threat to everything Abigail had built. One of them would have to fall, completely and permanently, before this could end. As dawn finally broke over the mountains, painting the smoke in shades of pink and gold, Dalton's remaining men began their retreat. They dragged their wounded with them, leaving 2 dead where they had fallen, men who would be buried in unmarked graves known only to the coyotes and buzzards. The Apache had suffered losses too, 1 warrior dead, 3 others wounded, and half the camp's structures reduced to ash and blackened frames. But they had held, they had survived, and more importantly, they had proven that the white men who came with fire and explosives were not invincible, could be turned back by determined resistance and intimate knowledge of the land. Eliana stood beside Chato on the outlook as they watched the defeated men retreat down the mountain trail. His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with a certainty that needed no words, and she understood that she had crossed some final threshold in the night's violence. She was no longer a refugee they sheltered out of honor to her mother's memory. She was a warrior of this band, someone who had literally thrown herself between danger and the community's most vulnerable, who had earned her place not through her white skin or her knowledge of trading, but through the most fundamental currency of frontier life, willingness to die so others might live. But even in that moment of hard-won solidarity, she knew the battle was only half won. Dalton had been driven back, but Abigail remained secure in her stolen ranch, protected by the fiction of legal ownership and the assumption that a woman in her position could not possibly be capable of such calculated evil. To truly end this, to reclaim not just her survival, but her birthright and her name, Eliana would need to do something the frontier rarely saw. She would need to beat Abigail at her own game. Using the white world's laws and assumptions against themselves, she would need to leave the safety of the mountains and walk back into the viper's nest, armed with nothing but truth and the terrifying presence of the warriors who now called her sister. The journey down from the mountains was not a retreat, but a procession, deliberate and ceremonial in its measured pace. Chato led a party of his finest warriors, men whose names were whispered in frontier saloons, with the same reverence usually reserved for natural disasters. They rode in formation around Eliana, not as captors displaying a prisoner, but as honor guard accompanying royalty to reclaim a throne. She wore a mixture of Apache and settler clothing, buckskin leggings beneath a repaired dress that had once been silk, her hair braided in the practical style of working women, a turquoise stone at her throat marking her as protected by forces that transcended law and custom. She looked like what she was, a woman who belonged to two worlds and would bow to neither. The discovery of the legal deed had come 3 nights before they descended, found exactly where her father's loyal servant had promised, in a letter that arrived through channels so circuitous that its journey alone testified to the power of true loyalty. The old servant, dying now in a boarding house in Tucson, had sent word through Mexican traders, through Apache runners, through the underground network of those who existed in the frontier's margins, until his message reached the mountains. He had sewn proof into the hem of Eliana's traveling dress before Abigail's men took her, unable to stop the betrayal, but able to plant the seed of its eventual undoing. The document itself was yellowed and water-stained, but the signature was unmistakably Thomas Thorne's distinctive hand, and the date preceded his marriage to Abigail by 3 years. It was his will, clear and unambiguous, leaving the entirety of his estate to his daughter, Eliana Rose Thorne, with provisions for his future wife only if she acted as faithful guardian to his child's interests until majority. There were notary seals, witness signatures from prominent Silver Creek businessmen, and most damning of all, detailed descriptions of property boundaries that matched the original territorial surveys, not the modified versions Abigail had filed with corrupted officials. Armed with this paper, and backed by warriors whose very presence redefined what was possible in a town used to viewing Apache as either hunted or hunters, never as political force, Eliana rode into Silver Creek just as the afternoon sun turned its single dusty street into a ribbon of liquid gold. The town's normal activity froze, as if God himself had halted time. Women gathering water from the public well stopped mid-motion, their buckets suspended in air. Men lounging outside the saloon let their cards fall from nerveless fingers. Children playing in the alley between buildings ceased their shouting and simply stared, their mouths forming perfect circles of shock. The sight was unprecedented and terrifying. The lost Thorne daughter, presumed dead or ruined beyond redemption, riding at the center of an Apache war party that moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit, heading directly toward the magistrate's office with purpose that brooked no discussion. Eliana saw recognition flash across faces, the butcher who had always given her father fair weight on meat purchases, the seamstress who had sewn her childhood dresses, the banker who had handled her father's accounts, and who now very deliberately stepped back into his building's shadow rather than meet her eyes. The magistrate's office sat at the end of the main street, a squat adobe building that had witnessed every legal transaction in Silver Creek's 15-year history. Magistrate Cornelius Ward was a practical man who understood that frontier justice was less about abstract law and more about maintaining the social order necessary for commerce and survival. He had approved Abigail's guardianship papers without excessive questioning, accepting her narrative of a stepdaughter gone wild with grief and requiring firm institutional control. Now he emerged onto his office's narrow porch, his face pale beneath his carefully maintained beard, watching an entirely different narrative approach on horseback. Chado dismounted first, his movements fluid and controlled, and positioned himself at the foot of the porch steps, in a stance that was not overtly threatening, but communicated absolute physical confidence. His warriors remained mounted, creating a perimeter around the building that was simultaneously protective and intimidating. Eliana dismounted last, with deliberate slowness, allowing every watching eye to see that she moved under her own power, that her body bore no marks of abuse or captivity, that her eyes were clear, and her bearing was that of someone who had spent recent weeks being forged in fires hot enough to burn away everything but essential truth. She mounted the steps alone, her father's will clutched in one hand, and faced Magistrate Ward with a directness that made the older man visibly uncomfortable. In a voice that carried clearly down the street, ensuring every eavesdropper could hear, she identified herself by her full legal name and stated her business. She had come to present evidence that her stepmother, Abigail Whitaker Thorne, had committed fraud, forgery, and attempted murder, and she demanded immediate investigation and restoration of her rightful property. Ward's eyes flickered between Eliana, the document she held, and the Apache warriors who waited with the patience of men who understood that time was often the most effective weapon. His bureaucrat's mind was clearly racing through implications, calculating which path held fewer thorns. If he dismissed Eliana's claims outright, he risked the wrath of her Apache protectors and the social chaos that would follow if the town's residents concluded their magistrate protected murderous theft. If he acknowledged her claim, he admitted his own failure to detect obvious fraud and potentially implicated himself in Abigail's conspiracy, whether through incompetence or corruption. The door behind Ward opened, and Abigail Whitaker herself emerged, having been summoned from her comfortable rooms at the Grand Hotel, where she was holding court as the town's wealthiest widow. She had dressed carefully for her role, severe black silk that spoke of mourning, though her husband had been dead for over a year, a cameo brooch at her throat, and an expression of shocked horror so perfectly calibrated that Eliana almost admired its artistry. Abigail's hand went to her breast as she gasped out her stepdaughter's name, her voice carrying just the right note of maternal concern, mixed with frightened confusion. But Eliana had learned in the mountains to read beyond words to the signals bodies could not lie about. She saw the micro-expression of rage that flashed across Abigail's face before the mask of concern settled into place. Saw the way her stepmother's eyes went immediately to Chado and his warriors, calculating threat assessment. Saw the subtle hand gesture that Abigail made toward the shadows where Dalton waited, still nursing wounds from the mountain assault. Her stepmother's first instinct was not joy at a presumed dead daughter's survival, but annoyance at a persistent problem that had failed to stay solved. Eliana spoke then, her words measured and clear, for the public record and for the audience of townspeople who were gathering despite their fear of the Apache presence. She laid out, in damning detail, the sequence of events: her father's death, the immediate changes Abigail had made to household and property, the suspicious documents with wrong dates and forged signatures, her own abduction under false pretenses, and delivery to men who were supposed to ensure her death appeared accidental or attributable to savage violence. She described how she had been saved by the Apache band her own mother had befriended decades ago, how she had survived through work and proof of value, and how she had finally obtained documentation that revealed the depth of her stepmother's betrayal. Throughout her recitation, Abigail's face underwent a fascinating evolution. The initial mask of maternal concern morphed into wounded innocence, then righteous indignation, then finally something colder and more honest. When Eliana finished, Abigail's response was not denial. but attack. She pointed out that her stepdaughter had been living among savages for months, that such an experience would naturally disorder any civilized woman's thinking, that the supposed will was obviously a forgery crafted by those same Apache to gain access to white lands and wealth. The accusations were elegant in their construction, leveraging every prejudice and fear the frontier held about Indians as inherently deceptive and white women as inherently fragile. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, each side marshalling arguments while the magistrates squirmed between competing pressures, except for an intervention from an unexpected source. The banker, the same man who had tried to avoid Eliana's gaze, stepped forward from the gathered crowd. His name was Samuel Chen, son of Chinese immigrants who had come to the territory during the railroad building and stayed to establish one of the few banks willing to serve the region's diverse population. He cleared his throat nervously and announced that he had been Thomas Thorne's personal banker, and that he still held in his vault several documents that Thomas had deposited for safekeeping, including a duplicate will identical to the one Eliana now held. The revelation hit like a dynamite blast. Chen continued, his confidence growing as he spoke truth he had apparently been sitting on for months, explaining that Thomas had updated his will after his diagnosis, knowing his time was limited, and had specifically instructed the banker to release the duplicate only if his daughter ever came to claim it or if suspicious circumstances surrounding her welfare came to light. Chen had been waiting, watching, hoping that Abigail would simply honor her late husband's wishes naturally, rather than forcing him to choose between legal obligation and personal safety. But seeing Eliana alive and making her claim, he could no longer remain silent without becoming complicit in fraud. Abigail's face went from pale to flushed as she realized the trap closing around her. She tried one final deflection, insisting that Thomas had been senile in his final days, that the will was the product of fever dreams and manipulation by scheming servants. But the banker shook his head firmly, producing from his coat pocket a letter, also in Thomas Thorne's hand, dated 3 days before the will, and explaining in lucid detail his concerns about his new wife's intentions and his desire to protect his daughter's inheritance from potential predation. Magistrate Ward, seeing the political winds shift decisively, made the calculation that preserved his own position. He announced that given the serious nature of the allegations and the documentary evidence presented, he was ordering an immediate investigation into the legitimacy of all property transfers that had occurred since Thomas Thorne's death. Abigail Whitaker would retain residence in the ranch house, but all financial transactions would be frozen pending a hearing scheduled for 2 weeks hence, and Miss Eliana Thorne was to be recognized as legitimate heir with standing to challenge any and all previous determinations. It was a bureaucrat's compromise, denying neither party complete victory, but establishing that Eliana's claim had sufficient merit to require formal adjudication. The crowd that had gathered began to murmur, the sound building like approaching thunder. Eliana could hear the whispers, the fragments of conversation as neighbors who had known her father began to discuss what they had always privately suspected, but never dared voice. The tide of public opinion was shifting, that intangible but powerful force that determined survival in small towns where reputation was currency, more valuable than gold. Abigail felt it too, her eyes darting between faces that had previously smiled at her with sycophantic warmth and now showed only cold assessment. As the crowd began to disperse, Abigail caught Eliana's eyes across the porch, and in that moment, all pretense fell away. The older woman's gaze held pure hatred, the kind of enmity that transcended mere greed or legal opposition and entered the realm of existential threat. Eliana understood then that the legal hearing would be only one battleground. Her stepmother would not surrender wealth and position through the slow grinding of institutional justice. She would strike in whatever way preserved her gains, even if it meant burning everything to ashes, rather than allowing Eliana to reclaim what was rightfully hers. But Eliana was no longer the frightened girl who had been bound and delivered to the devil's fist. She held Abigail's stare without flinching, her own expression communicating something her stepmother had never expected to see. absolute resolve backed by allies who did not play by the rules of civilized society, who understood violence as sometimes necessary, and justice as something that could exist outside courtrooms and legal documents. The message was clear. Continue this path and discover what happens when you back a mountain cat into a corner. As Chato and his warriors escorted Eliana back through Silver Creek's main street, she felt the weight of transformation settle over her like a mantle. She was no longer purely Thomas Thorne's daughter, or purely a woman of the Apache. She was something the frontier had rarely seen, a hybrid creature who could navigate both worlds with equal fluency, who understood both the law's arcane requirements and the older rules of blood and honor that governed survival in spaces where institutions held no power. The battle was not over, but she had proven to Abigail, to the town, and most importantly to herself, that she would not be erased, not by betrayal, not by violence, and not by the casual assumption that a young woman without male protection was inherently vulnerable. 3 years had passed since the day Eliana Thorne walked into Silver Creek flanked by Apache warriors, and the territory remembered it as the moment when the old certainties began to crack. The legal hearing that followed had been anticlimactic in its resolution. Faced with duplicate wills, banker testimony, and growing public sentiment, Abigail Whitaker had fled Silver Creek 2 nights before the scheduled proceedings, leaving behind debts and angry creditors, but escaping formal prosecution. Some said she made it to San Francisco, others claimed Mexico, but nobody seemed particularly invested in tracking her down. The theft had been reversed, the inheritance restored, and the frontier had more immediate concerns than pursuing a disgraced woman who no longer posed active threat. The Thorne Ranch, when Eliana finally returned to claim it, felt less like homecoming and more like visiting a museum of someone else's life. The buildings her father had built still stood solid against the desert wind, but they echoed with ghosts she no longer wished to carry. She walked through rooms that had once represented security, and found only the dusty artifacts of a world she had already left behind. The leather chair where her father had read evening papers, the kitchen where ranch hands had gathered for coffee before dawn, the bedroom where she had dreamed innocent dreams of simple futures, all of it felt like a costume she had outgrown, well made, but no longer fitting the shape of who she had become. Her decision emerged not from a single moment of clarity, but from the accumulation of mornings waking in the mountains and feeling more at home than she ever had in featherbeds, of conversations in mixed languages that communicated more truth than English ever had, of the way Chato's hand felt in hers, like the answer to questions she had not known how to ask. She spent 2 months managing the ranch's affairs with the same efficiency her father had taught her, but her attention was always divided, her gaze drifting toward the eastern ridges where smoke from cooking fires marked the location of a different kind of family. The solution, when it came, felt less like compromise and more like inevitability. She leased the ranch to a young family recently arrived from Texas, people whose eyes held hunger for land and opportunity, whose children would benefit from the security her father's infrastructure provided. The lease was generous in its terms, structured to give the family real stake in success, with provisions for eventual purchase if they proved good stewards. She kept only a small portion of the inheritance liquid, enough to facilitate trade relationships between the Apache bands and legitimate merchants, to create economic connections that might forestall future violence through the practical bonds of mutual profit. The territorial government, relieved to have a potential flashpoint resolved through commerce rather than cavalry intervention, granted limited trading rights that gave Eliana's Apache-affiliated ventures protection under mercantile law. It was imperfect, subject to the whims of changing administrations, and always one incident away from revocation, but it represented a crack in the wall that separated peoples, a proof of concept that economic integration might succeed, where force had only produced endless cycles of retaliation. On a morning when autumn first touched the high country with gold, Eliana rode back toward the mountains, carrying the last of her possessions that she had decided to keep. Chato met her at the tree line, his horse moving parallel to hers without need for discussion of direction or destination. They rode in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after countless smaller silences have woven themselves into understanding deeper than words could excavate. The rancheria had expanded slightly, incorporating families who had heard of the place where a white woman had earned acceptance through action rather than blood, where children like Little Hawk grew strong, and where old wounds might find unlikely healing. Enju, even more ancient now and moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body was finishing its contract with the earth, greeted Eliana's return with a grunt that might have been approval or might have been simple acknowledgement, but either way felt like benediction. That night, around the central fire where decisions of consequence were made and stories worth remembering were told, the band formalized what had already become true through action. There was a ceremony that Eliana did not fully understand in its traditional context, but she recognized the core meaning. She was being adopted not as curiosity or charity, but as full member, with all the obligations and protections that status entailed. When Chato stood to speak, his words carrying the cadence of formal pronouncement, she heard her name, her real name and her Apache name both, woven into a narrative about circles closing and debts paid across generations, about how sometimes the ancestors speak through circumstance and guide what seems like accident toward pattern and purpose. The legal part came later, accomplished through the same territorial magistrate who had presided over the hearing that restored her inheritance. Eliana Thorne and Chato, whose Christian name for legal purposes was listed as Charles Stone, were married in the brief civil ceremony that the territory recognized. The paperwork filed in triplicate and stamped with official seals that transformed personal bond into institutional fact. But the real marriage had happened over months of shared labor and silent communication, validated not by papers but by the way they moved through the world as unit, rather than separate entities. She learned in the years that followed that building bridges between worlds was not romantic adventure, but grinding daily work, requiring patience that sometimes felt indistinguishable from endurance. She spent weeks negotiating with suspicious merchants in Silver Creek, weeks more explaining to skeptical Apache why trading with whites was not betrayal, but strategy for survival, in a world that would not stop encroaching regardless of anyone's wishes. She failed as often as she succeeded, watching deals collapse over misunderstandings that no amount of translation could bridge, watching potential allies retreat behind walls of prejudice that felt impermeable as stone. But there were victories too, small and incremental, but real. A family of settlers who traded fairly and learned enough Apache to conduct negotiations directly, demonstrating respect through the effort of language acquisition. A band leader from a different rancheria who visited to study Eliana's trading system, considering whether similar relationships might protect his own people from the worst of what was coming. Children, both Apache and white, who grew up seeing the possibility of cross-cultural respect not as idealistic fantasy, but as documented reality, something that existed because people had chosen to build it through deliberate action. Little Hawk, the boy whose broken leg had been the turning point of Eliana's acceptance, grew into a young man with a gift for languages and mathematics. She taught him everything her father had taught her about accounting and inventory management, watching with fierce pride as he grasped concepts that would allow him to navigate both worlds with confidence. He would never be fully accepted in white society, but he would not be cheated, would not be dismissed as ignorant savage whose word could be broken without consequence. That kind of practical empowerment felt more valuable than any idealistic vision of perfect harmony that ignored the actual dynamics of power and survival. On an evening 5 years into her mountain life, as Eliana sat with Chato watching the sunset paint impossible colors across canyon walls, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about her father, wondering if he had somehow foreseen this path when he preserved those duplicate wills, when he married her mother, whose heart had recognized kinship across cultural boundaries. She thought about her mother, the woman she barely remembered, and wondered if genetics carried forward not just physical traits but inclinations of spirit, a tendency toward seeing humanity in unexpected places. The child sleeping in the wickiup behind her stirred and murmured in dreams. A daughter who would grow up belonging to multiple worlds, or perhaps to none of them, forging her own identity from the complicated inheritance her parents had given her. Eliana felt the weight and privilege of that responsibility, understanding that the choices she made now would ripple forward through time in ways she could not fully predict or control. She had not found a simple happy ending, because such things did not exist in a place and time where violence and beauty existed in such intimate proximity, where every gain came edged with loss, and every alliance required constant maintenance. But she had found something more valuable than simple happiness. She had found purpose, had found people worth standing with even when standing was difficult, had found in herself reserves of courage that her younger self could not have imagined possessing. The Apache called her Nadesti, which meant something close to lightning woman, not for rage but for the sudden illumination she brought to dark problems, for the way she could cut through complications with unexpected solutions. Her father would have appreciated the name, she thought, would have recognized in it the business acumen he had worked so hard to instill. But it was the Apache who had given it, who had looked beyond her white skin to see capacities she had not known she possessed until circumstances demanded their emergence. As full darkness settled over the mountains, Chato's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her close against the night's chill. Their daughter's breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of true sleep, and somewhere nearby, a nightbird called its territorial claim. The future was uncertain, still fraught with danger and difficulty. But for this moment, Eliana Thorne, Nadesti, was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by family that transcended blood, building something worth protecting even if it was imperfect and fragile and required constant tending. This was what survival looked like, she had learned. Not the absence of threat, but the presence of purpose. Not the elimination of difference, but the negotiation of coexistence. Not the grand gesture that solved everything, but the daily choice to continue building when continuation would have been easier to abandon. Her stepmother had intended cruelty, but had accidentally delivered grace, had thrown her into circumstances that revealed truths about strength and belonging that a comfortable life would have kept forever hidden. If she could have spoken to her younger self, the girl who had cowered in that wagon being delivered to her presumed death, she would have said simply, "You are so much more than you know. The desert has sharp edges, and you will be cut. But those cuts will reveal what you're made of. Trust the journey. Trust yourself. Trust that even in what looks like ending, something new can be born that justifies every scar you earn along the way. The women who came before you walked this path and survived. You carry their strength in your bones, even when you don't believe it exists. And the women who come after will walk easier, because you refuse to stay broken." In the distance, someone started a song, voice rising in the peculiar harmonics of Apache music that had sounded so alien to her in those first desperate weeks, but now felt like home's acoustic signature. Other voices joined, creating layers of sound that were simultaneously mournful and celebratory, acknowledging the difficulty of existence while insisting on the value of continuing anyway. Eliana added her own voice to the chorus, imperfect and accented but sincere, and felt Chato's chest vibrate with his own contribution, the sound resonating through her body like a second heartbeat. This was the legacy she would leave. Not wealth or property, though those mattered in practical terms, but the lived proof that bridges could be built between worlds that seemed impossibly separate, that courage could be found in unexpected places, that family was defined by choice and action rather than by accident of birth. And if that legacy inspired even one person to look beyond their assumptions and see the humanity in someone different from themselves, then all the pain and fear and struggle would have been worth it, would have purchased something that neither gold nor guns could ever provide. Hope that the future might be better than the past, one difficult choice at a time. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human drama, but beautiful in their constancy. And Eliana Thorne felt, for perhaps the first time in her life, completely at peace with who she had become. If you enjoyed this story of courage and redemption, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments which part of Eliana's journey resonated most with you, and let us know what corner of the world you're watching from. Each story we share is a chance to connect across our own distances. If you'd like to experience more tales of the frontier's hidden truths and unlikely heroes, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next adventure. These mountains have many more stories to tell.